thank you very much for being with us today. It's a great honor.
The honor is mine. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Ms. Novak.
How are you today?
I'm good. How about you? Amidst this COVID craziness.
Yeah,
Really?
I think we are all in the same situation. So we're feeling even more honored to have you with us today. And this is also what brings us together, because humanity is in a kind of uncertain situation. We are on unknown territory, and which brings innovation, which brings up questions, right? And this is why innovation is becoming more and more important and more inevitable. So first of all, I would like to ask you, given your professional background, what does innovation mean for you?
Innovation can mean a lot of things, as you say, depending on one's background, as well as one's foresight, looking forward. But I think irrespective to discipline or domain, what innovation involves is doing something that is either new or doing something that you've done before in a way that is novel. So it's either a radical leveling form of using a new tool or a new technique, or it's some uptake of an emerging tool or technique that has never been done before. Both of those can involve certain aspects of innovation, and I think they're not mutually exclusive. Very often we take what we have and we use it in new ways until we reach its limits, and then what we find ourselves doing is developing something new. And this is very interesting heuristic between our tools and our capabilities, our tools and our techniques. So techne and technique, the tools and our methods are interreliant. And I think when we reach certain points of constriction, where we hit constraints, whether it's contextual, as we see now with COVID, or it's a question of coming to the limits of our tool use, we're prompted to become innovative. And I think in many ways, it's also a question of perspective, how we look at it. Do we need something new or do we not?
Global pandemic situation we're living, also like the whole context of digital transformation, we're facing as humanity enormous challenges in so many sectors, like in the social sector, healthcare, right, environment, politics, economics, and also education. So what have you personally learned from this global situation we're currently living?
That working from home is not such a bad thing. It's very interesting because what it has demonstrated is that I think we've had tools that have been available to us for a while. The very vector that we're using to create the nexus here, that where you and I are talking and then we're able to reach an audience, this is certainly not brand new. We've been using these types of techniques and technologies for a number of years, but we've been using them because they're a convenience, not necessarily a necessity. Now, the COVID crisis has made this type of communication, this type of occupation, this type of even avocational pursuit, all the more a requirement to be able to be innovative, to use the tools we have, such as Zoom, Meeting Space, My Teams, etc., and or to develop new tools that allow a more different forms of virtual engagement and combined engagement, hybrid engagement, as we say, flipped engagement, where you have an in-person component that may or may not involve physical contact, but may involve some artifact where I'm moving something that you have on your desk or some tool that you have, and we're able to then communicate and engage remotely. So I think what it's done is it's made very apparent that there are certain constraints that very often we did not face, at least not frequently, and that these constraints have now become a part of our daily lives. And the question is, can we identify these gaps, analyze where the gaps are in our capability, and then compensate those gaps, and or also recognize where our weaknesses and our strengths lie, and utilize those strengths to overcome our weaknesses through technology, certainly, but then also through the social approaches and social methods and adaptations necessary to make that technology a more viable, feasible, and I think valuable aspect of the way that we engage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very crucial point you're mentioning. It's because when we're talking about digital transformation, we're thinking of technology in the first place. But to make it work, really, we can't live beside the whole social and emotional integration of this technology, right? So there is also a big discussion in innovation about what comes first. Is it technology that triggers social innovation,
right,
or is it first the persons who change and then integrate technology into their behavior? So
correct. Well,
what's your
if you
opinion?
recall, I mean, seeing to that point was the constraints of the technology on our connectivity, whereas now this new situation, the COVID crisis, has forced us to use this technology as it was somewhat originally designed and developed, to be a vector, a nexus, and a trajectory towards our increased capacity for connection. And the fact that we simply cannot engage interpersonally, physically, as much as we had before, necessitates this technology not only being used as it is, but being developed in ways that allow a more social dynamic to become part of the milieu of this technological realm.
You mentioned technology as a vector, right, to making changes, and also, but now we have kind of been forced to make those changes, as you've mentioned, because of this disruption also that COVID-19 brought us on the whole planet. And this is one of the characteristics about disruptions, that no one really sees them coming or doesn't take them really seriously until they actually are. So my last question for you is, what would you recommend for the situation we are living today from an innovation point of view, and also from your expertise? And also, what would you recommend to make our world, with all the challenges we're facing, a better place?
The idea of, you have to take a look in the mirror and then make that change. I mean, the lyrics are, I think, important. And what I think COVID has prompted us to do is to look in the proverbial mirror of our own capability, our own constraints, and in some cases, our limitations that we've placed upon ourselves, as well as our capabilities. Let me explain. I think that one of the things that has come into stark relief is that we cannot be so intrusive to our environments and our ecologies without recognizing the burden that it will ultimately place not only on those ecologies and those fauna and those flora, but ultimately our own, because we do exist in something of a dynamical equilibrium with the various ecologies and niches that we occupy. Science and technology has allowed us to intrude on various niches, various ecologies, to disrupt the climate. And one of the things that can happen as a consequence is a disruption of the relative allostatic balance of different species' capabilities, incapabilities, and pathologies. And this is what we're seeing, an increased vectoring of animal and perhaps even other forms of diseases, plant diseases, that are then spreading more into human-based ecologies, human environments, and human life worlds. So yeah, science and technology allows us to expand, allows us to intrude, and to essentially reestablish our own environments and ecologies. But we have to respect the fact that there is indeed a biological balance that our science and technology may interfere with and disrupt, and as a consequence of our innovation, we're then paying something of the price of at least the inconvenience, and at very, very worst, the inability to then rebalance that ecology. Point number one. Mm-hmm. So I think becoming more sensitive, more sensible, more reflective, and more responsible about the way we use our science, technology, and even our social structures with regard to our global environments will become ever more a reality. I think this is something that COVID has seen. Mm-hmm. Number two, COVID, although the novelty of the SARS-CoV virus was in fact relatively indeed new, we've had SARS-CoV viruses in the past. And I must tell you, from a biosecurity standpoint, we knew that various global biosecurity infrastructures and functions were a relatively weak point or Achilles heel in a variety of different programs of not only national security, but international security and global health. So once again, we had technology that allowed us to be able to gain insights, but as you said, we didn't pay attention to it. And of course, you're speaking to an American. And in many ways, I think we can look to America and say, this is a real problem for us in the United States. The intelligence was there, the public health warnings were there, the foreknowledge of the possibility of at least an epidemic or not a pandemic disrupting the fabric of our biology, our sociology, our psychological and economic daily lives was certainly well known, but not appreciated. The question then is whether or not we actually have to fall into the abyss to appreciate the abyss.
Mm.
So if we then back up, we can say, what have we learned from this? What has COVID taught us? And what can we do going forward, which was the essence of your question. How one globe, we are many cultures, but we share a number of anthropological commonalities. How then will we cooperate as well as compete? And I think that's one of the things that COVID has brought to the fore. There is some level of competition. Who is going to get the vaccine? Who is going to develop the antiviral? We hear this being discussed competitively. One country is doing better than the other country. How can we be like them? How can we do things differently? But one of the things that keeps coming to the fore and should come to the fore is how can we work together? How can we conjoin our ideas, our ideals, and our ideologies to be more inventive and innovative and do so in a way that breaks down some of those existing social, psychological, economic, and even geopolitical barriers to recognize that the only way we're going to be able to essentially survive and flourish to the extent that we can, given the technology we have, is to be far more cooperative and collaborative in our approaches towards innovation. I think that the idea of innovation prompts cooperation. My research group, for example, has advocated the idea of cooperative competition. In other words, we understand that there will always be competition. There will always be the need for certain hegemonies and power struggles and balances. But working cooperatively in such a way as to determine, well, this is good for their power, and our power together to create more viable ecologies, I think certainly is one of the prompts towards what I would call this new reglobalization innovative capacity that we need to be facing after COVID. I think the new normal will be a bit different than the old normal and should be.
Hopefully. Right?
Hopefully. I agree, hopefully.
Do you have any best practice example for this kind of cooperative competence?
Well, I have some examples of bad practices, not best practices. And this is not with any particular political orientation. This is no partisanry on my part whatsoever. But this is not the time for separatism. This is not the time to begin to withdraw from global organizations that are oriented towards public health, global safety, ecological stability, community support. It's not the time to withdraw. It's the time to engage. And I think that the best practices of discourse and also real intelligent dialectic. Let me explain. A dialectical approach would be one that admits and acknowledges that we may have different perspectives, but also creates a set of ground rules that respects certain differences and how those differences may need to exist to be able to reach commonality that is going to have some equilibrium in terms of its benefit. So I think the nature of international discourse to be more dialectic rather than just discursive is going to be one of the best practices, coupled with a more cosmopolitan appreciation for different cultures' history, philosophies, needs, values, and ethics, to move away from just a Western orientation to be far more of a combinatory orientation that is going to fit the tasks and enterprises at hand.
This is also an invitation to all the audience we have today, and maybe all together we can co-create this world. We can start finding new tools of collaboration, of co-creation, of doing things together and not necessarily against each other, because in the end we are living on this very planet we are sharing between all of us. So thank you very, very much, Dr. James Giordano,